The Haunted Heart of Illinois, A Journey Through Darkness. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 3 years documenting the paranormal activity across Illinois. What started as a curiosity after my grandmother's death became an obsession, a need to understand what lies beyond the veil between life and death. I'm not a ghost hunter in the traditional sense. I don't carry fancy equipment or film everything for social media. I'm a journalist, a skeptic turned believer, and these are the stories of the 5 places that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, where the dead still walk. The first time I visited Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, it was a crisp October afternoon. The leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way down the overgrown path off the Midlothian Turnpike. The cemetery has been abandoned since the 1960s, and nature has reclaimed most of it. Vandals destroyed many of the headstones decades ago, leaving the grounds looking like a war zone of broken marble and forgotten names. I'd read about Bachelor's Grove for years. It's consistently ranked as one of the most haunted cemeteries in America, and the stories are endless. The ghost lights, the phantom farmhouse that appears and disappears, the two-headed man. But what drew me there was the photograph. The famous image taken by the Ghost Research Society in 1991 that showed a translucent woman in white sitting on a tombstone. The Madonna of Bachelor's Grove, they called her. As I walked through the cemetery that first day, I felt nothing unusual. The sun was bright, birds were singing, and I almost laughed at myself for being nervous. I took photographs of the overturned headstones, the dried-up lagoon where mobsters allegedly dumped bodies during Prohibition, and the cemetery's strange isolation in the middle of the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve. It wasn't until I sat down on a fallen tombstone to rest that things changed. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The birds stopped singing, and then I heard it, a woman crying. Not a distant sound, but close, as if she were sitting right next to me. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was no one there. The crying continued for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped as abruptly as it had started. The warmth returned. The birds resumed their songs. I checked my watch. It was 3:47 p.m. I would have dismissed it as imagination or wind through the trees, but when I got home and reviewed my photographs, there was something in one of them. In the background of a shot I'd taken of the lagoon, there was a figure. A woman in a light-colored dress, standing at the water's edge. I know for certain there was no one else in the cemetery that day. I'd been completely alone. I returned to Bachelor's Grove 7 more times over the next 6 months. Each visit brought something new. Once, I saw blue orbs of light dancing between the trees just after sunset, the famous ghost lights that have been reported since the 1940s. Another time, my camera battery drained from full to dead in less than 2 minutes. A jogger I interviewed on the path told me he'd seen a phantom farmhouse materialize in the woods, complete with a glowing porch light, before it faded away like morning mist. But the most terrifying experience happened on my 8th visit. I'd brought my friend Rebecca with me, thinking safety in numbers would help with my growing unease. We arrived just before dusk, and as we walked toward the cemetery entrance, we both saw him, a man standing among the graves, watching us. He was tall, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, and even from a distance, something was wrong with his silhouette. As we got closer, my stomach turned. His head wasn't right. It looked distorted, wrong, like it was split or doubled. Rebecca grabbed my arm. "Sarah, do you see?" The figure vanished. Simply ceased to exist between one blink and the next. We left immediately and didn't speak the entire drive home. Later, I would learn about the legend of the two-headed man, a spirit that's been reported at Bachelor's Grove since the 1970s. I can't explain what we saw that night, but I know what we didn't see, a living person. Resurrection Mary, the girl who never made it home. After Bachelor's Grove, I became consumed with documenting Illinois haunted locations. The next story I had to investigate was Resurrection Mary, probably the most famous ghost story in Chicago, if not the entire Midwest. The legend goes like this. In the early 1930s, a young blonde woman in a white dress was killed in a car accident on Archer Avenue after leaving a dance at the O. Henry Ballroom. She was buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois. Since then, dozens of people have reported picking up a beautiful young woman in a white dress hitchhiking along Archer Avenue, only to have her vanish from their car as they pass the cemetery gates. I spent weeks interviewing people who claimed to have encountered her. The stories were remarkably consistent. She's described as being in her late teens or early 20s, with blonde hair and blue eyes, wearing a white party dress and dancing shoes. She's cold to the touch. She rarely speaks, and she always asks for a ride heading north on Archer Avenue. One man I interviewed, a retired cab driver named Frank Kowalski, swore he'd picked her up 3 times over his 40-year career. She'd get in the back seat, give me an address in the city, and we'd drive in silence, he told me, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. Each time as we passed Resurrection Cemetery, she'd scream, "Stop!" I'd slam on the brakes, turn around, and she'd be gone. Just vanished. The door never opened. She just wasn't there anymore. The most famous incident occurred in 1976 when a passing motorist called police to report that a young woman was locked inside Resurrection Cemetery, desperately trying to get out. Officers found no woman, but they did find something disturbing. 2 of the bronze bars on the cemetery gate were bent apart, with what appeared to be handprints seared into the metal. The bars showed fingerprints that had been burned into the bronze with incredible heat. The cemetery management later removed that section of the gate, claiming it had been damaged by a truck, but photographs of those handprints still circulate today. I drove Archer Avenue at night more times than I can count, always hoping, always watching. For months, nothing happened. I was beginning to think Resurrection Mary was just an urban legend, a story that had grown in the telling. Then, on a rainy March night, it happened. I was driving north on Archer Avenue around 11:30 p.m. when I saw her. A young woman in a white dress, standing on the side of the road near the O. Henry Ballroom's old location. She was soaking wet, and even though it was barely 40 degrees outside, she wore no jacket. I pulled over immediately. She opened the passenger door and got in without saying a word. She was beautiful, with pale skin and blonde hair that hung in wet strands around her face. But she was wrong somehow. Her eyes were empty, distant, and when I asked if she was okay, she didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead. "Where do you need to go?" I asked. "Home," she whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from far away. I started driving and she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. I tried to make conversation, asked her name, if she needed me to call anyone, if she wanted to go to a hospital. Nothing, just silence and that empty stare. As we approached Resurrection Cemetery, she suddenly turned to look at me. Her eyes were filled with such profound sadness that tears immediately sprang to my own eyes. "I can't go back," she said. "I can't leave." And then she was gone. The seat beside me was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart exploding in my chest, and looked around wildly. Nothing. No one. The passenger door was still closed. The interior of my car was freezing cold, my breath fogging in the air. I sat there on Archer Avenue for 20 minutes, crying and shaking, before I could drive again. When I got home, I found that my passenger seat was soaking wet, even though the girl had vanished. The water took 3 days to fully dry. I've never driven Archer Avenue at night again. Manteno State Hospital, the Asylum of Lost Souls. Manteno State Hospital is where my investigation took its darkest turn. The facility opened in 1930 as a psychiatric hospital and was once one of the largest such institutions in Illinois, housing over 8,000 patients at its peak. It closed in 1985, but its history is written in suffering. In 1939, a typhoid fever outbreak killed at least 47 patients, though some historians believe the real number was much higher. The hospital buried many of them in unmarked graves on the property. Throughout its operation, Manteno was plagued by allegations of patient abuse, inhumane treatment, and experimental procedures that would be considered torture by today's standards. The buildings that remain are crumbling monuments to institutional horror. Some have been converted to other uses, but several stand abandoned, their windows broken, their halls echoing with emptiness. I visited Manteno on a gray November afternoon with a paranormal investigation team I'd met through my research. We'd obtained permission to explore one of the abandoned buildings, the old infirmary, where many of the typhoid victims had died. The moment we stepped inside, I knew we'd made a mistake. The air was thick and oppressive, heavy with a sense of despair that was almost physical. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and the floors were littered with debris, broken furniture, old medical equipment, scattered patient files from decades ago. We split up to cover more ground, which, in hindsight, was foolish. I was with just one other person, a woman named Angela who'd been investigating the paranormal for 10 years. We made our way to the 3rd floor, where the isolation rooms had been located. The isolation rooms were small, windowless cells where violent or difficult patients had been locked away. Some still had restraints bolted to the walls. Looking at those rooms, knowing what had happened there, made me physically ill. Angela was using an EMF detector, a device that measures electromagnetic fields, which supposedly spike in the presence of paranormal activity. As we approached the last isolation room at the end of the hall, the detector started screaming. The lights flashed red, indicating an extremely strong field. "Something's in there," Angela whispered. The door to the room was closed. I could hear sounds from inside, shuffling, scratching, and what sounded like labored breathing. Angela reached for the door handle, but before she could touch it, the door slammed open with such force that it crashed against the wall. The room was empty, but the temperature inside was Arctic, at least 30 degrees colder than the hallway. And on the back wall, written in what looked like frost, were 2 words: "Help US." We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran down those stairs, and out of that building like demons were chasing us. Maybe they were. Later, when I reviewed the audio recording from my phone, I heard something I hadn't noticed while we were there. Underneath our voices, our footsteps, our breathing, there was another sound. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all whispering together. I couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, anguished. I spoke to former employees of Manteno State Hospital, people who'd worked there in the 1970s and 80s. Every single one of them had stories. Nurses who'd seen shadow figures in the hallways. Doctors who'd heard screaming from empty rooms. Security guards who'd watched doors lock and unlock by themselves. One woman told me she'd been working a night shift in 1982 when she saw a man in old-fashioned patient clothing walking down a hallway. She called out to him, thinking he was lost, but he walked straight through a locked door and disappeared. The hospital kept logs of unexplained incidents, reports of paranormal activity filed by staff. In the 5 years before it closed, there were over 300 documented reports. The hospital administration explained them away as stress, overwork, and imagination. But I've read those reports. Whatever happened at Manteno State Hospital, it left a stain that hasn't faded. I've had nightmares about that place ever since my visit. In my dreams, I'm walking through those empty hallways and all the doors are opening, and people are emerging, pale, thin, wearing hospital gowns from decades ago. They reach for me, their mouths moving, begging for something I can't give them. Peace, maybe, recognition, a witness to their suffering. I wake up crying from those dreams. McPike Mansion, the house that remembers. After Manteno, I needed a break. The investigation was taking a toll on my mental health, and my editor at the newspaper was concerned about how obsessed I'd become. But I couldn't stop. I was too close to understanding something important about the nature of death and memory, and the places where tragedy leaves its mark. McPike Mansion in Alton, Illinois, became my next obsession. Built in 1869 by Henry Guest McPike, a successful businessman, the mansion is a stunning example of Italianate Victorian architecture. For decades, it was one of the finest homes in Alton, with 15 rooms, elaborate woodwork, and beautiful gardens. But the mansion fell into disrepair after the McPike family sold it in 1936. It changed hands multiple times, was used as an apartment building, and eventually was abandoned entirely in the 1950s. By the time I visited in 2023, it had been sitting empty for over 70 years, though recent owners had begun restoration efforts. Alton itself is considered one of the most haunted cities in America, with a history that includes Civil War prisons, deadly epidemics, and underground tunnels used by escaped slaves on the Underground Railroad. McPike Mansion is perhaps the crown jewel of Alton's haunted locations. I arranged a private tour with the owners, a couple who'd purchased the mansion with plans to restore it to its former glory. They were open about the paranormal activity, telling me they'd experienced countless unexplained events since taking ownership. "We've heard voices, footsteps on the stairs when no one's there, and the smell of roses in rooms where nothing's blooming," the owner, Patricia, told me. "We've had tools go missing and then reappear in completely different locations. But the scariest thing is the basement. No one wants to go down there alone. There's something about that space that just feels malevolent." The mansion was breathtaking despite its decay. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers of different patterns from different eras. The wooden floors were warped and stained. Vines grew through broken windows, and entire sections of the ceiling had collapsed, but you could still see the grandeur it had once possessed. Patricia led me through the main floor, showing me the parlor where the McPikes had entertained guests, the dining room with its elaborate fireplace, and the conservatory where Sarah McPike had grown orchids. As we walked, I kept feeling like someone was watching us, though Patricia and I were alone in the house. On the second floor, we entered what had been a bedroom. Patricia explained that this was where Paul Lechinger, a caretaker who lived in the mansion in the 1940s, had died. He'd been found in this room, and many people believed his spirit had never left. As Patricia was talking, I felt a distinct touch on my shoulder, a hand gentle but firm, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. Patricia saw my reaction and smiled sadly. "That happens a lot in this room," she said. "I think Paul wants us to know he's still here." But it was the basement that truly terrified me. Patricia led me down the narrow wooden stairs, and with each step, the temperature dropped and the air grew heavier. The basement was dark, damp, and filled with debris from decades of neglect. Old furniture, broken crates, and piles of moldering fabric created a maze of shadows. "The activity is strongest in the far corner," Patricia said, pointing to the back of the basement. "That's where people have seen shadow figures and heard voices. One psychic who visited said there's a portal there, whatever that means." We made our way to the back corner, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a certainty that we were not alone and not welcome. I started taking photographs, and on my camera's screen, I could see orbs, dozens of them, floating through the air like fireflies. Then I heard it, a voice, deep and angry, speaking directly into my ear. "Get out!" I grabbed Patricia's arm. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her face pale. "We need to leave." Now, as we hurried back toward the stairs, something crashed behind us, something heavy hitting the floor. We didn't stop to look. We ran up those basement stairs and didn't slow down until we were outside in the sunlight. Later, when I reviewed my photographs, there was something in one of them that made my blood run cold. In the darkness of that back corner, barely visible, was the outline of a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he was staring directly at the camera with eyes that reflected the flash like an animal's. I showed the photo to Patricia, and she went pale. "That's the third time someone's captured that figure on camera," she said. "We don't know who he is or what he wants, but every psychic who's visited has said the same thing. He's angry, and he doesn't want anyone in his space." I've often wondered about that figure. Was it Paul Lechinger, angry about strangers invading his home? Was it someone else, someone with a darker history tied to that house? The mansion has stood for over 150 years, and countless people have lived and died there. How many of them might have left something behind? Congress Plaza Hotel, where the past lives on. My final investigation brought me to the Congress Plaza Hotel in Chicago, a grand dame of hotels that has stood on South Michigan Avenue since 1893. Built for the world's Columbian Exposition, the hotel has hosted presidents, celebrities, and countless ordinary travelers over its 130-year history. It's also reportedly one of the most haunted hotels in the United States. The hotel's paranormal reputation centers around several spirits. There's Pegleg Johnny, a vagrant who supposedly lived in the hotel in the 1920s and 30s, doing odd jobs in exchange for a place to sleep. Legend says he was killed in a fall down a service stairwell, and his spirit still roams the halls, his peg leg making a distinctive tapping sound. There's the woman in black, seen on the 12th floor, always dressed in mourning clothes. And there are the children, ghostly boys who supposedly died in a fire decades ago, who are heard laughing and running in empty hallways. I checked into the Congress Plaza Hotel on a Tuesday night in April. I'd booked a room on the 12th floor, where most of the paranormal activity has been reported. The hotel was beautiful in a faded, old-world way, with high ceilings, ornate molding, and an atmosphere that spoke of a grander era. My room was clean but dated, with heavy drapes, dark wood furniture, and a view of Grant Park. I set up my equipment, a voice recorder, a camera, and an EMF detector I'd borrowed from Angela after our Manteno experience. Then I settled in to wait. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I watched television, read, and tried to stay alert. Around midnight, I decided to walk the halls, exploring the 12th floor and looking for anything unusual. The hallways were quiet and empty, lit by dim sconces that created more shadows than light. I walked slowly, listening, watching, waiting. At the end of one hallway, I heard it, children laughing. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of boys at play, running and shouting. I followed the sound, my heart pounding. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the halls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint a source. As I turned a corner, I saw them. Two boys, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing old-fashioned clothing, knickers, button-up shirts, suspenders. They were playing tag, running back and forth in the hallway, laughing. They looked as solid and real as any living children. I stood frozen, watching them, my rational mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. One of the boys looked directly at me, smiled, and waved. Then they both ran toward a wall and simply passed through it, vanishing like smoke. I stood in that hallway for a long time, trembling, trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. Eventually, I returned to my room, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Around 3 a.m., I heard the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic sound like someone walking with a cane or a wooden leg. It came down the hallway outside my room, slow and steady. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The tapping continued past my door and faded into the distance. I learned later that 3 a.m. is when most guests report hearing Peg-Leg Johnny's footsteps. Some have even opened their doors to find a disheveled man standing in the hallway, who vanishes when approached. The most unsettling experience came just before dawn. I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, when I felt the mattress shift. It was subtle, like someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. I opened my eyes and turned on the bedside lamp. There was no one there, but I could still feel the weight on the mattress, the indentation where someone was sitting. As I stared, a woman materialized beside me. She was translucent, dressed in black with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was sad, lined with grief, and she was looking at something I couldn't see, some distant point or memory. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only watch as she sat there, motionless, lost in her sorrow. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, she faded away. The weight on the mattress disappeared, and I was alone again. I checked out of the Congress Plaza Hotel that morning and haven't been back since. The desk clerk, a young man who'd been working there for 5 years, smiled knowingly when I turned in my key. 12th floor, he asked. I nodded. You saw her, didn't you? The woman in black. How did you know? He shrugged. People check out early from the 12th floor all the time, and they all have that same look you do right now. Like you've seen something you can't explain and can't forget. He was right. I can't forget any of it. Aftermath, living with the unknown. It's been 6 months since my last investigation, and I've tried to return to normal life. I write articles about local politics and community events. I go to dinner with friends. I pretend that everything is the same as it was before I started this journey. But it's not. I'm not. I know now that death is not the end. I don't know what comes after, or why some people or some places hold on to the past. But I know with absolute certainty that there is more to reality than what we can see and touch and measure. Sometimes I still hear whispers when I'm alone. I see shadows move in my peripheral vision. I wake up in the middle of the night with the certainty that someone is standing in my bedroom doorway, watching. My grandmother died 3 years ago, and it was her death that started all of this. She came to me in a dream a week after she passed, and she looked young and healthy and happy. She told me not to be afraid of death, that it was just a doorway, and that she was waiting on the other side. I didn't believe her then. I thought grief was making me imagine things, that my subconscious was trying to comfort me. Now I believe. Now I understand. The haunted places of Illinois, Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, the stretch of Archer Avenue where Resurrection Mary still searches for home, the asylum at Manteno where suffering left scars that haven't healed, the mansion in Alton where the past refuses to be forgotten, the hotel in Chicago where spirits walk among the living, they're all the same. They're places where the veil between worlds has worn thin, where the dead remain because they have unfinished business, or because they don't know they're dead, or simply because they loved or suffered so intensely that they left an imprint on the physical world. I don't know if I'll ever investigate another haunted location. Part of me wants to stop, to go back to pretending that the world is simple and rational and safe. But another part of me, the part that looked into the empty eyes of Resurrection Mary, that heard the pleading voices at Manteno, that felt the weight of the woman in black sitting on my bed, that part knows I can't stop. Because someone needs to bear witness to these stories. Someone needs to remember the dead and acknowledge their presence. My grandmother was right. Death is just a doorway. And in Illinois, in these haunted places I've documented, that doorway has been left ajar. The dead walk among us, not always peacefully, not always benevolently, but always with purpose. I don't know what that purpose is, but I know I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand it, trying to bridge that gap between the living and the dead, trying to help both sides find peace. Because that's what these places need, ultimately. Not fear, not sensationalism, not ghost tour and equipment and theories. They need peace. They need to be remembered. They need someone to care about the stories they're trying to tell. And so I'll keep listening, even when it terrifies me, even when I wish I could unhear and unsee what I've experienced. I'll keep listening because the dead deserve to be heard. And because, deep down, I know that one day I'll join them on the other side of that doorway, and I hope someone will listen to my story too. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my experiences. I share these stories not to sensationalize or exploit the dead, but to honor their presence and help others understand that there's more to our world than what we can see. If you'd like to hear more about my investigations into the paranormal, the other haunted locations I've visited, the theories I've developed, and the connections I've made with others who have experienced the unexplainable, please like this story, subscribe to follow my journey, and ring the bell so you'll be notified whenever I share new encounters. I have so many more stories to tell, so many more voices that need to be heard. Join me as I continue to walk the line between the living and the dead, documenting the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our everyday world.